to all of you. Oh,
Yeah,
now it's
it's there. Yeah. From now
hello.
on, you should be careful.
Yeah,
The NSA is listening.
Of course, always.
yeah. It'll be maybe uploaded at the YouTube website, I think, of the APLN of the KMPS, I think, and hopefully. So yeah, this time now, I think, is there Elaine or Junsang is there? Yes, thank you very much for organizing all of the event. Elaine over there? No?
Yes.
Thank you for your service. And how many people registered yesterday and today?
I think
Do you
a
know?
total of around 60 people registered.
60. Okay. All right. Thank you very much for coming today. So wonderful webinar for the APLN and KMPS, Korea Nuclear Policy Society. Today is the second day session, and I very appreciate you for the wonderful time of the panelists, which I would like to introduce very briefly and introduce by yourself firstly before the presentation. And the first speaker will be Tong Zhao, which is a good friend of mine in Beijing and Carnegie Tsinghua Center, and he will present today about the simple steps for nuclear weapon state to honor their disarmament commitment for the Korean Journal on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Energy. And second speaker will be Professor Ramesh and Thakur, and his article for the journal will be the title, The Non-Proliferation Law Trouble and the Continuity Shifting Disarmament Global Post, the NPT at 50. And it's very honored to have you today. And the third speaker for today is Dr. Angela Woodward from New Zealand, right? And her title today is about the journal article from her topic is nuclear weapons free zone, which is very controversial and hot topic today. And it's very honored to have you, Dr. Lina Young, Director of the Nuclear Security at the KINEC Korea. And I'll give you the maximum 15 minutes to presentation or less than that. You will have a presentation, and Dr. Lina Young will have a discussion for 3 speakers presentation, and then we can have a more free discussion for 15 minutes or something like that. And before the starting our webinar, I'd like to introduce our journal, the Korean Journal on Nuclear Non-Proliferation Energy, which maybe I will share some my monitor. Can you see that? Tong, can you see this one? Yeah. Yeah, this is the website of the Korean Journal on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Energy, which is created by the Korean Nuclear Policy Society and the Korean MOFA, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So MOFA sponsored this journal, and which was the first journal was published in 2 years ago. And this year we have the special issue just for the last month with the APLN member, and I'd like to have a webinar of the order for this special issue. So this is the last issue of the journal, and we have the Moon Jung-in, APLN Vice President, special remarks, and Lee Sang-hyun, publisher welcome remarks, and then our friend Nobuyasu Abe, Ramesh Thakur, Tong Zhao, John Tillman, John Bong-gun, Angela Woodward, and Suzuki, and the other guy. So this is a mainly an English language journal, and I'd like to have all of you to introduce interest this journal, and you can download the journal for free from the website that www.koreanuclearpolicysociety.org. So I'm the managing editor, and publisher is the Dr. Lee Sang-young, now the president of the Sejong Institute. So all of you guys, please introduce by yourself very shortly, and then we can have a first presentation. So Tom, introduce by yourself for 10 seconds or something.
Thank you, Professor Kim. This is Tong Zhao from Beijing. I'm a senior fellow at Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. And maybe I have met with you in Seoul 2 years ago at the KNDU seminar with Toby Dalton, right? And I'd like to see you soon after this pandemic. And Ramesh, please introduce yourself. Mic on, please.
Ramesh Thakur, Emeritus Professor at the Australian National University in Canberra, which just means I'm retired and have no particular affiliation active anymore.
No, excellent. Enjoy your life, and now you're Edmonton guy. And thank you very much for coming today. And Angela.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim. My name is Angela Woodward. I'm Deputy Executive Director at VERTIC, the Verification Research Training and Information Centre, which is based in London. I work remotely from my home here in New Zealand. I'm also the Program Director for the Compliance Mechanisms and Measures program at VERTIC, where I currently work on projects on the United Nations sanctions on North Korea. I have also served on the Public Advisory Committee on Disarmament and Arms Control to the New Zealand Government Cabinet appointed committee. So I've served 2 terms on that committee as well. So I'm well networked in New Zealand. Thank you very much.
All right, excellent, Angela. Thank you very much. And Nayang, please introduce yourself.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody here. And my name is Nayang Lee. I'm working in KINEC. KINEC is Korea Institute of Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Control. And I'm Director General in Office of Nuclear Security. So basically, I'm working on implementing nuclear security, so kind of physical protection, cyber security, and so on. And I'm also working on Center of Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Security Academy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your valuable time. Now today, so we have the 60 or 70 guys as an audience. So maybe during the presentation, any guys maybe who write some chatting as a question, and then I can collect all questions to all of the speakers after their presentation. So we have now 70 minutes or something, and please welcome Dr. Tong Zhao for his first presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Kim. It's a great honor to contribute to this journal and a great pleasure to be part of this webinar. I think I will offer 3 recommendations in terms of how to promote nuclear disarmament among the nuclear weapon states, and also to help bridge the gap between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states on the issue of nuclear disarmament. The first point I want to make is in many nuclear weapon states, there is very little incentive at the operational level within the government to promote nuclear disarmament or arms control. People at the operational level within the bureaucracy tends to view their responsibility as to strengthen deterrent capabilities. And they usually resist, delay, and minimize discussions about arms control. Even efforts to promote small changes, such as to call for greater nuclear transparency or modest self restrictions on certain capabilities, are very unappealing to these operational level policymakers. I think given this situation, it would be really important for the national leaders to intervene and to provide an explicit endorsement about the goal of achieving the eventual goal of nuclear disarmament, and to give their open support for the concept and idea of nuclear arms control, especially in countries with very centralized decision-making systems. This type of top-level endorsement and blessing and support is critically important to overcome domestic bureaucratic inertia and long-standing traditions of secrecy, etc. So I think first point I want to make is we really need top-level affirmation for arms control and disarmament from all the nuclear weapon states. The second point I want to make is the nuclear weapon states should consider adopting a code of conduct to reduce the role of nuclear weapons. We have talked about the importance of reducing the role of nuclear weapons in national security strategy for a long time, but I think there are some very simple steps that the civilian governments of nuclear weapon states can take to actually contribute to the reduction of the role of nuclear weapons. For example, I think government officials from nuclear weapon states should refrain from declaring that their nuclear weapons contribute to their country's international prestige or great power status. Nuclear weapons should only serve the role of offering a strategic deterrent in when a country faces an existential threat. They should not become a source of national prestige or a source of a country's great power status. And today, we often hear national leaders making such statements openly that their nuclear weapons play this role. And that certainly enhance the role of nuclear weapons in addition to the deterrent role that they should play. So I think firstly, government officials should refrain from making such statements. And secondly, I think if you look at the national media, including domestic social media accounts run by some civilian government agencies responsible for arms control issues, you can easily mistaken their social media accounts for the Department for Armament rather than the Department for Arms Control, because they constantly tweet or post about topics that glorify nuclear weapons, right? So I think that really runs counter to their role as a civilian government agency that is supposed to promote arms control rather than to glorify nuclear weapons. And these domestic national media accounts controlled by national governments, as well as the social media accounts controlled by relevant government agencies, they should fulfill their responsibility to educate the public and to promote discussions about arms control rather than encouraging the general public to view nuclear weapons in a very favorable manner. So that's a second step they can take to avoid glorifying nuclear weapons through national media or domestic social media accounts run by civilian government agencies. And in addition, I think in many nuclear weapon states, there is zero domestic discussion among the general public about topics on arms control or disarmament. I think that's very strange. Without any domestic public discussion or debate on these issues, there will be zero public interest, let alone public support for arms control or disarmament. So I think in order for nuclear weapon states to fulfill their role to promote arms control and disarmament, they should at least start education programs that would promote such domestic discussions within government officials and the general public. These efforts to set up a basic code of conduct would be very easy to implement for national governments. They wouldn't require nuclear weapon states to commit to any immediate limitations on their nuclear weapons, but in the long run, they could help pave the ground for a domestic and international environment that is conducive to arms control and disarmament. My last point, very briefly, is we are seeing a trend where some nuclear weapon states are seriously working on new technologies that use nuclear power that uses nuclear technology to power their nuclear weapon delivery systems. Russia is working on nuclear-powered cruise missiles and nuclear-powered long-range nuclear torpedoes. And I think there is evidence that some other nuclear weapon states are also seriously examining these options. I think that's a dangerous trend. And if we look at the nuclear field, in the civilian nuclear field, there has been discussions about, there has been mechanisms about liability in case some accidents happens at civilian nuclear facilities. But there is no such liability mechanism to apply to military nuclear systems. The Japan government set up this prominent persons group that proposed setting up a liability mechanism that would apply to nuclear weapon incidents. But I think this proposal should be further broadened to also apply to military testing and development of nuclear-powered weapon systems. If there is some incident that happens in such nuclear testing and development of a delivery system during peacetime, they should also be held accountable for any damage caused to third-party interests, including public health and environmental integrity. And if we set up this liability mechanism today, we could help nuclear weapon states better appreciate all the risks associated with their new systems and therefore discourage them from pursuing these dangerous new weapon systems. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent presentation, Tong, as he briefly point out this current issue, which is some controversial as well. We can have more discussion after our presentation. And Professor Thakur, welcome to your presentation.
Thank you, Professor Kim. My chapter or my article in the journal deals with the achievements, but also the challenges of the NPT. In March, which is 73 years after the NPT was negotiated, the United Kingdom announced a decision to increase its nuclear warheads to 260 by the middle of this decade because of what they called the evolving security environment. The question that occurred to those of us who are active in this field as researchers and advocates is, how is this consistent with Article 6 of the NPT and also with the Prohibition Treaty or the Ban Treaty that actually entered into force on 22nd January 2021. Let me remind everyone that Article 6 is very clear and emphatic. It commits each state party to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament, unquote. Furthermore, in 1996, in a famous advisory opinion, the World Court strengthened this obligation by saying, quote, there exists an obligation to pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiations leading to nuclear disarmament in all its aspects, unquote. For half a century, with the NPT having entered into force in 1970, nuclear peace has rested on the normative pillars of the NPT. But in the 6 years since the last failed NPT review conference in 2015, we have seen geopolitical tensions spike in Europe, the Middle East, across the Himalayas, and in East Asia. Russia and the United States, which between them still hold more than 90% of global nuclear warhead stockpiles. Both have reinvested heavily in modernizing, upgrading, and expanding their nuclear arsenals. The existing nuclear arms control architecture, as we all know, is fraying. So a hostile international security environment, proliferation of nuclear weapons, and emergence of new space, cyber, and AI technologies have increased the risk of either accidental or even deliberate use of nuclear weapons. So against this broader context, what are the accomplishments of the NPT? If you go back to the original bargain, there were three legs: peaceful uses of nuclear energy, non-proliferation, and disarmament. I think the NPT has been extremely successful in facilitating, with appropriate and increasingly stringent and toughened safeguards, transfer of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes from those who have the expertise and the materials to others who wished to pursue them. Now, of course, interest in nuclear power has waned, particularly since the Fukushima nuclear accident in 2011. Nonetheless, it hasn't disappeared, but the NPT has been broadly successful in that. The NPT has also been remarkably successful in its non-proliferation leg or non-proliferation pillar. Remember that in the 1960s, there were genuine fears that by the end of the 70s, we would have some 20 to 25 countries possessing nuclear weapons. That never came to pass, largely owing to the NPT, which managed to contain non-proliferation pretty much to the point where today, certainly, the only problem countries are those who actually have the bomb. So there is no further additional non-proliferation immediate concern at the moment, but I'll come back to that. However, the disarmament pillar has never been active at all. One of the criticisms against the ban treaty, for example, is that not a single nuclear warhead will be dismantled as a result of the ban treaty. Well, the sad reality is that in 50 years of the NPT in operation, not a single nuclear warhead has been dismantled under the auspices of the NPT. Not a single disarmament conference has ever been convened under the auspices of the NPT. And that remains then the biggest challenge. So regardless of what one thinks of the NPT's historical record in underpinning strategic stability, in recent years, nuclear risks have grown, as I said, with heightened geopolitical tensions, additional roles for nuclear weapons, blurred boundaries between nuclear and precision conventional munitions, and expanding frontiers in space, cyber, and AI technologies. In terms of challenges then, the first challenge for the NPT is to hold the line on non-proliferation, in the sense that although all countries that are non-nuclear have pretty much signed on, and the only exception really is South Sudan, and that's because it's a new state. Nonetheless, there are genuine fears that some countries that are NPT states parties and not as non-nuclear weapon states could break out and go down that path for all sorts of reasons, which we can discuss later. The second challenge is that the NPT has always suffered from what we call institutional deficits. It has no secretariat or implementing organization, unlike, for example, the CTBT or the Chemical Weapons Convention. It meets only at 5-yearly intervals at the NPT Review Conference. It has no institutional machinery to monitor and provide regular oversight of treaty implementation and challenges. The review conferences have alternated between failed and successful outcomes. And the last one was a failure in that there was no agreed outcome document. And so we don't even have every 5 years a final document that summarizes progress achieved, and a forward-looking agenda. The decisions that are taken at the review conference are in the nature of recommendations with no binding requirements, no reporting requirements, there's no monitoring mechanism, and there's no compliance authority. And a major two-part performance assessment that we did from my center, the Center for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, showed very clearly that on peaceful uses, it's a good record. On non-proliferation, it's a mixed record. On disarmament, it's an abysmal record, even with regard to the mild, soft recommendations that they avoid under the lowest common denominator. But the biggest challenge today now is the reality of the existence of a second global treaty for acting as a stewardship of the global nuclear order. And for the first time, the global nuclear order has been effectively bifurcated, and we have two different treaties for setting global nuclear directions and norms. I think for most of us on the advocacy side, the two instruments should be seen as mutually reinforcing and supportive rather than contradictory and inconsistent. Doctrinally, they are compatible. And in practical terms, it doesn't make sense either to insist on non-proliferation, but sidestep disarmament, or to allow proliferation while working for disarmament. So what the Ban Treaty does is it establishes a new normative settling point on the ethics, the legality, and the legitimacy of the bomb. For most of us working in the field, the bomb has always been immoral. Now it is also illegal. It consolidates and expands the NPT-centric nuclear norms with regard to possession of the bomb, use of the bomb, threat of use of the bomb, testing, and going beyond the NPT, also stationing. It also offsets institutional deficits by scheduling biannual assemblies of states parties, and the first one is due to be held within 1 year of entry into force. So by January next year, we should have one. And it also provides for extraordinary meetings as necessary. So what was the impetus behind the Ban Treaty? Firstly, the growing consciousness of rising nuclear dangers. Second, growing frustration, and in some countries and constituencies, growing anger at the stalled nuclear arms control negotiations. And third, exasperation at the dismissive attitude of the nuclear powers towards nuclear disarmament. They paid lip service, but it was very clear that none of them took the obligation seriously at all. The movement for the Ban Treaty gained international traction by reframing the national security discourse in the language of universal humanitarian principles. Effectively, what we argued was that the foreseeable effects of use anytime in the future make the doctrine of deterrence and the possession of nuclear weapons morally unacceptable even in the present. Now, of course, the Ban Treaty cannot impose legal obligations on non-parties, but it will redesign the envelope of humanitarian laws, norms, practices, and discourse that collectively shape how we think about and how we act in relation to nuclear weapons. In other words, it shifts the balance of costs and benefits of possession, deterrence doctrines, and deployment practices. And the nuclear possessor states know that, which is why they have been so fiercely opposed to it and have tried their best to discredit it. I would make one further argument, and that is that far from damaging the NPT, it's possible that in the fullness of time, we'll come to appreciate that the Ban Treaty may have rescued the NPT from a deepening crisis of legitimacy and a threat of mass exit. And there's one further consideration that is important for us in Asia, and that is that 4 of the 9 possessor countries are Asian, but of the 4, only 1 is actually an NPT state party. And consequently, the NPT is mostly irrelevant for regulating the conduct of the Asian nuclear weapons possessor states. We needed something beyond that. We needed an additional and alternative normative framework, and the Ban Treaty gives us that. It also means that under the Ban Treaty, possession by the NPT nuclear weapon states is itself now considered illegitimate, even if not illegal in terms of their non-signatory. But because it's illegitimate, they cannot use the NPT as normative framework against which to measure the conduct of the 3 non-NPT possessor states in the Asia Pacific. And therefore, it's the Ban Treaty that is a relevant international standard for affirming universally applicable norms, not the NPT. To conclude then, it seems to me that 50 years after coming into force, the NPT regime is at the crossroads. If the nuclear weapon states, the 5 nuclear weapon states, continue to disrespect the mandated multilateral process and negotiated treaty that the Ban Treaty represents, then the divide between the 2 camps could harden. Such a destabilizing outcome would not be in anyone's interest. But the polarization and divisions have resulted from the decision of the nuclear armed states and their allies to part company with the dominant sentiment and policy preferences of the international community, not the other way around. And therefore, it's time for them to rejoin the global mainstream on nuclear policy and to work collectively to implement practical and credible measures towards nuclear risk reduction along the lines that Tong was outlining, for example, and also disarmament, while holding fast to non-proliferation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kirk. You mentioned this very significant issue, and feels like for me as a keynote speech, right, on NPT and TPNW. Thank you for your insight, and we can have a more discussion during the discussion time. Now it's time for Dr. Woodward, and I'd like to hear your insight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim, and thank you to the APLN and the Korea Nuclear Policy Society for inviting me to write this paper on the role of nuclear weapon-free zones in reinforcing the NPT. As we approach the 10th review conference of the NPT, it is helpful to take a step back and look at the wider nuclear governance framework and consider how efforts in one area may help to strengthen other elements of the framework. Nuclear weapon-free zones do not tend to receive as much attention within this framework, at least at the global policy level, perhaps because they're working quite well. So it might be helpful to reorient ourselves with these zones at this point in time and consider what opportunities they provide to strengthen the international framework and to help reduce nuclear risks. In my paper, I discuss how nuclear weapon-free zone treaties help to reinforce the NPT by establishing complementary obligations, rules, and procedures that give effect to the NPT's 3 pillars. I discuss what additional benefits these zone treaties provide, what challenges there are in fulfilling nuclear weapon-free zone objectives, and I provide some food for thought on establishing a nuclear weapon-free zone in Northeast Asia. So the NPT envisaged the establishment of nuclear weapon-free zones in Article 7, which acknowledges the right of a group of states to establish regional zones free of nuclear weapons. There are currently 5 regional nuclear weapon-free zones in the regions of Latin America, the South Pacific, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Central Asia. In addition, there is agreement in principle on a Middle East weapons of mass destruction free zone and long-standing proposals for a Northeast Asia nuclear weapon-free zone. And Mongolia has also declared itself a single-state nuclear weapon-free zone. These treaties play a valuable role in reaffirming their states parties' commitments under the NPT relating to non-proliferation, peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and disarmament. With respect to non-proliferation, nuclear weapon-free zone treaties comprehensively prohibit all activities that enable a state to achieve a nuclear weapons capability. They also prohibit their states parties from hosting nuclear weapons on their territory within the zone. With respect to the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, nuclear weapon-free zone treaties reinforce the NPT's nuclear safeguards obligations by also requiring their states parties to conclude safeguards agreements with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And in fact, successive nuclear weapon-free zone treaties have applied the latest safeguard standards as they build upon earlier nuclear weapon-free zone treaties and take account of best practice in the intervening years. With respect to nuclear disarmament, while nuclear weapon-free zone treaties states parties do not possess nuclear weapons or station nuclear weapons on their territory, these treaties are a means for their states parties as NPT non-nuclear weapon states to demonstrate their implementation of Article 6, under which all NPT states parties, nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states alike, are obliged to take action to end the nuclear arms race and pursue nuclear disarmament. Through their membership of nuclear weapon-free zones treaties, the states parties reaffirm their nuclear disarmament obligations and take measures to prohibit and prevent nuclear weapons activities in their jurisdiction. In addition, as supplementary agreements to the NPT, nuclear weapon-free zone treaties also complement and expand on NPT obligations. For example, nuclear weapon-free zone treaties have broader nuclear non-proliferation obligations than the NPT, in that they expressly prohibit the deployment and stationing of nuclear weapons in states parties' territory, and they provide for their states parties to unilaterally prohibit the transit of nuclear weapons through their territory within the zone. In contrast, certain NPT non-nuclear weapon states that are outside a nuclear weapon-free zone continue to host US nuclear weapons under the NATO nuclear sharing arrangements. While the weapons are legally under US control, some consider that these hosting arrangements contravene the spirit, at least, of the NPT's non-proliferation commitments. So what is the impact of nuclear weapon-free zones, given they are largely complementary to, and certainly not contradictory of, the NPT? Well, they have the effect of further entrenching the non-nuclear weapon state or non-nuclear armed status of their states parties. They also effectively limit the geographic spread of operational nuclear weapons and thereby reduce opportunities for nuclear arms racing, miscalculation, and nuclear risk escalation during times of heightened political tension. In this way, nuclear weapon-free zones make a valuable contribution to national, regional, and global security. The 1975 United Nations study on nuclear weapon-free zones noted their value in averting nuclear weapons proliferation, arresting the nuclear arms race, and diminishing the danger of nuclear war. In particular, for former nuclear arms states, these treaties are one avenue for re-engaging with the international community on nuclear issues and giving international legal effect to their national policies and laws on irreversible nuclear disarmament, as occurred with South Africa. As supplementary treaties that support the NPT, nuclear weapon-free zones also support the centrality of the United Nations in nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament efforts. The UN has played a valuable role in endorsing the concept and development of nuclear weapon-free zones. The UN also helps to facilitate cooperation between the zone parties to enhance their implementation. Each regional nuclear weapon-free zone treaty also helps to fulfill the NPT's purpose and objectives by espousing the nuclear-free principles and diplomatic styles of their respective regional organizations and states parties. This effectively provides for regional approaches to implementation of the core NPT principles and to the monitoring and verification of each nuclear weapon-free zone treaty. It is evident that each nuclear weapon-free zone was developed taking into account the special characteristics of each region, which is a key principle of the UN guidelines on establishing such zones. For example, the South Pacific Nuclear-Free Zone includes undertakings to prevent the dumping of radioactive materials within the zone, as a result of concern about the impact of radioactive contamination from nuclear weapons testing in the region. And the Africa Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone explicitly prohibits nuclear weapons research, following South Africa's dismantlement of its nuclear weapons program, which precipitated the zone's creation. However, there remain challenges in fulfilling nuclear weapon-free zone objectives. While nuclear weapon-free zone states have successfully excluded nuclear weapons within their regions, their goal of legally prohibiting the use of nuclear weapons against them has proved elusive. Nuclear weapon-free zone treaty states parties had an expectation that the nuclear weapon states would not use or threaten to use, through nuclear deterrence, nuclear weapons against them, in return for them further committing not to acquire nuclear weapons. However, while each nuclear weapon-free zone treaty provides for nuclear weapon states to commit to legally binding nuclear security assurances, the United States has only ratified the protocol under the Latin America Treaty, and Russia has only ratified the protocols to the Latin America and South Pacific Zone treaties. Nuclear weapon states have similarly not been forthcoming in agreeing to not to violate the treaties, such as by stationing or testing nuclear weapons within the zone, that is, in their overseas territories within the zones. Another challenge has been in achieving universality of the nuclear weapon-free zone treaties throughout their regions. Other challenges include the need for enhanced transparency about the zones and their operation and implementation, challenges in compliance assessment, and interzonal communication and cooperation. Turning now to the proposals for a Northeast Asia nuclear weapon-free zone, the prospect of such a zone was raised as early as 1981 as part of a peace zone proposal in the region, and again in 1991, which led to a joint declaration between North Korea and South Korea that included elements of a nuclear weapon-free zone, such as prohibiting nuclear weapons activities and establishing a control commission to oversee implementation. However, since then, North Korea has developed nuclear weapons and withdrawn from the NPT, making the rollback of its nuclear weapons program exponentially more complicated. It is still very worthwhile to pursue a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Northeast Asia region, as it would have many positive outcomes. It would be extremely helpful in reducing nuclear tensions in the region between the nuclear weapon states that have security interests in the region, US, Russia, and China, and between the regional non-nuclear weapon states and the nuclear armed state of North Korea. Having those nuclear weapon states join a legally binding nuclear security assurance under a nuclear weapon-free zone treaty would go a long way to allay the legitimate security concerns of North Korea, as well as of South Korea and Japan. A nuclear weapon-free zone treaty could prove a very helpful mechanism for achieving nuclear security assurances, which have not been able to be agreed multilaterally between these states to date. A Northeast Asia nuclear weapon-free zone would also further cement the non-proliferation obligations of nuclear-capable states in the region, in particular South Korea and Japan. A regional nuclear weapon-free zone treaty would also provide a forum for dialogue with the NPT nuclear weapon states and potentially other nuclear armed states on disarmament issues away from the politics of the NPT. In addition, the process of verifying the complete and irreversible disarmament of the nuclear armed state of North Korea will build experience and capacity for the longer-term process of verifying nuclear disarmament by the NPT nuclear weapon states and, ideally, the other 3 nuclear armed states. There are certain characteristics of the Northeast Asia region's nuclear governance framework that may help to advance a nuclear weapon-free zone in this region. For example, it isn't a prerequisite to be a state party to the NPT in order to join a nuclear weapon-free zone treaty, as long as the zone treaty eligibility requirements have been met, specifically being non-nuclear armed. So North Korea could complete disarmament and join a nuclear weapon-free zone before going on to rejoin the NPT, for example. Also, it is possible to remain in a nuclear security alliance while also being a member of a nuclear weapon-free zone and the NPT, as Australia has shown. However, this would not be possible for those states that also join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Finally, regional partners could helpfully restart a dialogue on much-needed transparency and confidence-building measures to help nuclear risk reduction in the region. These should be held as a prelude and not an alternative to achieving the long-term objective of denuclearization. The Asia-Pacific Leadership Network has held constructive discussions on these issues in recent years, and further such meetings should be encouraged. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. It is a wonderful presentation. Maybe we can have a seminar on particularly this topic, Northeast Asia nuclear free zone, because there's a very good idea and supported. Yesterday, I have some seminar on this topic. One guy, Dr. Hong Hyun-ik of the Seoul Institute, interestingly make the argument that he if North Korea give up their nuclear weapons, maybe we can ask China to provide the nuclear extended deterrence on North Korea. Otherwise, North Korea will not give up their nuclear weapons. And this kind of topic is all relevant to the Northeast Asia, the nuclear free zone issue as well. And Dr. Lina Young, please have your comment or question to all of speakers.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the speakers for the very interesting and wonderful presentation. In fact, you have only 10 to 12 minutes, but I already read the journal. So my question will include those journal contents. So first, Dr. Tong Zhao, thank you for the very interesting explanation. So your title itself is a summary of your talk, but to me, is it that simple step? I'm not sure whether it is that simple, but okay. So here's my question to you. It's good to hear that the leader's role, you mentioned about leader's role is very important. And in your article, you mentioned that President Xi's supportive action to the disarmament. China is the almost only one state left to affect North Korean issues, nuclear programs. So what do you think about the position of the China on North Korean issue? I mean, nuclear programs. So is there any possibility or way that China may include other 4 more nuclear weapon states to issue joint statement against the North Korean nuclear and missile issues? And that is my question to you, Dong Zhao. So, okay, then my second question is to Dr. Ramesh Thakur. Okay, thank you for your view. You shared your view about 3 pillars, especially on the disarmament part of the NPT and the role of the TPNW. Frankly speaking, I didn't know about TPNW that much. So, but it is very interesting to hear that we have 4 nuclear possessors outside of the NPT, and 5 nuclear weapon states in the NPT are now kind of violator of the TPNW in some sense. So you mentioned that the TPNW can play a role to support nuclear non-proliferation. So complementary rules. So is there any further discussion on TPNW? You mentioned about maybe next year you'll have another meeting, but is there any activities or events planned during the next review conference of NPT? That is my question to Dr. Ramesh Thakur. And finally, Angela, thank you for the comprehensive explanation on the nuclear weapon free zones, the history, meaning in the NPT and its measures and so on. So I mean, North Korean issue is very important to me, and North Korean is not that it is they already possess nuclear weapons. So besides the not likely the past, I could not find the strong will or leader in any in Northeast Asian region to establish the nuclear weapon free zone. So here's my question to you, Angela. You mentioned the APLN. You have a very fruitful discussion among APLN leadership network. So including it, what is your perspective in the progress to establish the nuclear weapon free zone in the Northeast Asian region? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. And naturally, we would like to listen the answer from Tong and Ramesh and Angela. Please have your answer, Tong.
You want me to go first? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for the question. I really appreciate it. It's about China's position on North Korea's nuclear program. I think it's clear that China shares the interests as other countries in this region about the eventual goal of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. But for the near term, I think China also, because of its major power competition with the United States, China becomes, I think, a little more sympathetic towards North Korean position. China indeed believes that the US hasn't done its part to respond to previous so-called unilateral North Korean concessions or restrictions. So the ball from the Chinese perspective is in the American court. Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi just recently said at Tsinghua World Peace Forum that the UN permanent members should consider activating the provisions in previous UN sanction resolutions that says that if North Korea makes some progress in terms of its nuclear program, the UN should reduce its sanctions accordingly. So China made that request again. So it looks like in the near-term future, China will continue its previous message that other countries need to do more to prepare the ground for reciprocal and incremental steps taken by all parties. And this year represents a special year in the bilateral relationship between China and North Korea. The two countries will renew their friendship and peace agreement in a few days, in a couple of days, I think. There are, these provide further opportunities for the two sides to strengthen their political relationship, which means China is not in a position to join a joint statement against North Korea's nuclear program.
All right, thank you for the wonderful answer, and Ramesh, and your answer to the question.
Yes. Thanks, Dr. Lee. I think it's worth reminding the audience that the 122 countries that voted to adopt the ban treaty back in July 2017, every single one of those is a state party of the NPT. So NPT state party in good standing. All the 54 states that have ratified the ban treaty are NPT states parties. All the 86 signatories of the ban treaty are NPT states parties. And therefore this tension, this alleged tension, comes about because of the decision by the nuclear weapons possessing countries to dissociate themselves from the process and the outcome of the humanitarian initiative, the conference, the negotiating conference, and the ban treaty that resulted. But because they are all states parties, I think the first item on the agenda remains the postponed NPT review conference. And depending on the discussions there and the nature of the outcome of that conference, the agenda will take shape accordingly of the first meeting, Assembly of States Parties of the ban treaty. In terms of its statute, that meeting has to be held by January next year, as I said in my presentation, in my opening remarks. But the reality is all international events, like pretty much all of life, has been badly disrupted and affected by the COVID crisis, by the coronavirus pandemic. Where things stand at the moment, when will the review conference be held, already postponed from last year? We really don't know. We hope it will still be held this year, in which case likely first meeting of the Assembly of State Parties for the ban treaty will be next year. But the substantive agenda of the ban treaty assembly meeting will unquestionably be heavily influenced by what happens at the review conference. And efforts, no doubt, will be made to harmonize and reconcile. But if it's a one-way street in terms of efforts to harmonize and reconcile, all you get is hostility and diatribes and abusive language from the other side, then at some stage, I think the goodwill will begin to evaporate even on the part of the NPT states parties that are in the ban treaty. And there, I think the umbrella states like South Korea, like Japan, like Australia, have a particular role to play. Because we are not possessor states, but we do shelter under the nuclear umbrella. And I think we have a particular bridge building role to play in trying to make sure that this destabilizing outcome of a complete rupture doesn't take place, because that will be very damaging for everyone. So I think there is a role for us in that respect. And part of that will be, I think, I would like many of the umbrella states to give an indication in advance that they hope and intend to attend the first meeting assembly of the states parties as observers without having to sign the Ban Treaty. They can still take part, they can engage constructively. In my view, it was a bad political mistake, as well as, in my individual view, an illegal boycott by the umbrella states not to take part in the original negotiation in the conference. It violates Article 6 obligations. This was a UN mandated, UN conference, it's a UN treaty, and I just don't see how not attending can be held to be compatible with Article 6 obligation, which extends, let me remind you, to every NPT state party. Article 6 doesn't apply only to those who have the bomb. It applies to every country that is party to that treaty. So how we could justify under international law not attending is, with the best goodwill in the world, completely beyond my imagination. I think it was both illegal and a political mistake. And I hope we'll play a more constructive role from this point on in trying to bring the two together.
Thank you very much for your answer. And Angela, would you please?
Thank you. Big question. What are the prospects for a nuclear weapon-free zone in Northeast Asia? I certainly hope that there can be one at some point in time. I think a lot of this, of course, will hinge on the US. And of course, we've just seen the Biden administration complete their North Korea policy review. And the outcome seems to be that their approach will be calibrated and practical, advancing from the strategic patience of the Obama administration and whatever was under the Trump administration. But no one quite knows what this means, calibrated and practical. It doesn't help that their envoy on North Korea issues is only part-time while serving as an ambassador to another country. It seems that the US is in waiting mode to advance any kind of discussion or dialogue with North Korea, and if there's the fear that if they wait till there's some provocation from North Korea, that they're on the back foot. But they're clearly not going to enter a dialogue without a goal, but they don't want to be too ambitious or have talks for talk's sake. So, I mean, I'm always in favor of dialogue, and I think there's certainly a need for discussion on transparency and confidence building measures as a prelude to anything else. And North Korea has been quite clear what it wants as to discuss as a way forward of starting these sorts of discussions. They want to have a peace agreement. They want to normalize, well, it's advantageous to normalize diplomatic relations. And perhaps they could even start by engaging on discussion on nuclear disarmament verification, the technical process, what it entails, just to have a dialogue about it, much like the P5 process is having a dialogue about nuclear issues under NPT, just to start talking together. My organisation, Vertex, has been doing a lot of work on training and capacity building on nuclear disarmament verification, and it would be helpful to have North Korea engaged in that kind of process so that if and when they do verifiably and completely disarm, it's done in a way that everyone understands. And clearly, North Korea wants negative security assurances. So all of that could usefully be discussed and could be wrapped up within a Northeast Asian nuclear weapon-free zone. You'd get the verified disarmament and the negative security assurances. You can't have one without the other. So I think the starting point of all of this is to have a dialogue, try and develop some transparency and confidence building measures. Certainly track 1 is helpful, but perhaps even track 1.5 or track 2 discussions and the likes of the APLN, I think would be a useful grouping to be engaged in that kind of dialogue process, have ideas and exchange ideas. hopefully we'll get one.
What a good idea. I'd like to have a North Korean speaker on that issue, possibly next year or something like that, as a track 1.5 or track 2, even Chesani as a keynote speaker, I don't know. And maybe we can learn something about how lose weight of your Kim Jong-un dear leader or something like that. It's a long time to wait. Ambassador Abe, would you please have your talk or question, whatever?
Yes.
And then, yeah, thank you.
Yes. As to the last point Dr. Tantal made, I share the concern that introduction of nuclear-powered torpedoes or cruise missiles will increase the risk of environmental contamination with radioactive material. The same concern, similar concern I share, but American Army is now working on introducing micro-reactors to provide electricity to the war fronts. That also risks the environmental pollution. So, but Russians may argue, look, now carriers and submarines are powered by nuclear reactors. What's wrong with powering cruise missiles and torpedoes? I wonder how Dr. Tonsal argue back that argument.
So, Tom, would you?
Thank you, Ambassador Abe, for the great question. I'll just say briefly that I think it's a valid question. And I think all countries that develop, test, operate these nuclear-powered military systems should be held accountable. So this liability mechanism should be applied to all types of nuclear-powered military systems, including aircraft carriers or new nuclear torpedoes or cruise missiles. I think that's something that hasn't been done, but it's high time to fill that gap.
Any other guys? Angela or Ramesh, Nayang, and a comment on? No? Any other audience, including yesterday panel members, would like to have any kind of comment or question, whatever? Professor Jambungun is there, or Tanya? Professor Hansen? Dr. Suzuki? No? They keep silent. All right. So I'd like to have some short question to all of you, and before having some question from the audience, we have only 10 to 15 minutes, and I have a research on the Biden, Putin, and Xi Jinping triangle at the conference and relation, and on the all right. I found some question. All right, John, what about the question I typed in earlier about the can you see the question answer section? John asked about, John, would you please have a speak again? Your question is the, John, would you please?
He's talking about a report that China is looking at
All right.
advanced nuclear technologies.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe Tong Zhao can answer that.
All right.
I
Excellent.
think Tom would be a very good person to answer it, but I'm open to anyone who wants to have a crack at it.
All right. Yeah. Thank you for your sharing a wonderful report. And then Tom, would you first, and then Angela, Ramesh, or Nayang, you can maybe have your own opinion. Tom, would you please reply to the John question?
Hi, John. I'm sorry, I couldn't see your original question. I only know it's about these new reports of Chinese interest. I mean, that interest has been public for some time. You know, the researchers in the defense ministry, they certainly closely follow what other major nuclear weapons do. And we shouldn't underestimate the impact of the so-called role models. They really inspire other countries to follow suit. And in the Chinese case, there has been, again, interest in the research community in the national defense industry. But the key question is whether their interest would be approved by the political decision makers. And I think in that regard, we have more and more uncertainties because the current Chinese paramount leader is very interested in strengthening Chinese strategic military capability. In fact, he personally ordered during the 2 sessions, the most important Chinese annual political conferences in spring this year, that the Chinese military should accelerate the construction of advanced strategic deterrent capabilities. I think that's a very strong and clear signal, unprecedented from China's most senior leader. I think that will give people a sense of how much strong support there is in the Chinese leadership for better and more advanced nuclear capabilities. So I think the urgency for all nuclear weapon states to examine this issue seriously, to take into consideration all the potential implications, not only for national security, but also for public health and environmental impact. We know that the Russian testing of the nuclear, exotic nuclear weapon systems has already resulted in at least one serious nuclear radiological incident that has affected the health and environment of Russian people. So if countries embark on this path, there will be more similar incidents. This is something that should be taken into consideration in their comprehensive review about the wisdom to go down this path.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Excellent. Ramesh, would you continue?
Yes, John, I'd make 3 points, and they're obviously linked and they build on each other. Firstly, while I have my criticisms of aspects of China's external policies in other areas, as you know, I have argued for many years now that when it comes to nuclear policy, of all the 9 countries that have nuclear weapons, I'm quite prepared to argue that China has been the single most responsible of the 9 countries in terms of the origins and its deliberate, restrained posture and refusal to be drawn into nuclear arms race and any effort at a sprint to parity. Now, originally, of course, there were limitations of money and technology going back to 1964 and the first test and subsequent developments. But even as China has grown richer and wealthier and has reserves of cash, its nuclear policy has remained quite low key and clearly aimed at deterring blackmail by others rather than engaging in a nuclear blackmail of its own or coercion. And I think we need to acknowledge that and praise that. And I think it's important to remember that. The second point is, nonetheless, the reality is we are well past the dyadic relationship of the Cold War between Moscow and Washington that set the stage for the entire architecture of nuclear arms control. And now we are into the age of nuclear chains and cascading effects. And the idea that Russia and the United States can modernize and upgrade endlessly and without limits, and that will not have implications for the defense postures and strategies of the other countries with the bomb, that is fanciful. That's so unrealistic as to be dangerous thinking and delusional. So if they keep on that path, sooner or later, that has implications for China's legitimate defense perspectives. As long as it has nuclear weapons, it will seek to respond in ways open to it. And if China does so, then India will in turn look at what China is doing and see if that has implications for its defense needs. And if India takes certain measures, then Pakistan will look at that and see what it needs to do. And that's what I mean about the cascading effect in this interlinked chain of nuclear weapons possessing in these countries. So the dyadic world is gone, and we need to acknowledge that. And the third and final point, again, builds on the second point. And that is that any new global architecture for nuclear arms control now has to be not just trilateral, but it needs to bring in all the possessor countries, not necessarily for everything, but I think the world of just looking at bilateral dyadic pairs in order to explore nuclear risk reduction on the pathway to nuclear disarmament, that world is gone forever. So we need to consider how to bring different countries into these discussions and negotiations. Maybe begin small, maybe begin with a few countries. One of the projects that we'd like to explore collaboratively with other institutions, for example, is the China, India, Pakistan nuclear triangle, and how we can engage in risk reduction measures there. We've had some meetings on that in which Tong certainly has taken part in the past, and we've discussed that, as Ambassador Abe will be recalled, within the APLN. So I think all these factors now bring together, and that's why, and I'll finish up with this again, that's why I think the TPNW, the Nuclear Ban Treaty, is a more relevant global normative framework than the NPT, which for all its successes now has limited potential. And in fact, I would go further. I think it has exhausted its normative potential as far as nuclear risk reduction and disarmament is concerned.
All right. Angela, would you please share the...
No, I have no comments on that, but I have a question for Professor Thakur, if there is time.
Good, excellent. Would you mic on?
Okay, thank you, Ramesh. I'm interested how you think the NPT RevCon is going to handle the TPNW. I read your paper with great interest, and clearly I tend to agree with you that the normative power now lies with TPNW. But how is the NPT, as the framework cornerstone treaty, going to deal with the TPNW? Is it going to, do you have hopes for a final document this time?
One of the problems, but I guess also one of the blessings of the restrictions we face thanks to COVID, is that we are cut off from capitals and centers where these discussions are going on actively. And I really can't answer that. The political leaders and the diplomats have exempted themselves from the restrictions that apply to the rest of us. I'm sure it's the same in New Zealand, but in Australia, political leaders that want to travel for international purposes exempt themselves and go off and do it. But we need permission from the government, which is not easily obtainable. As I said, the price of that is I'm cut off from the discussions. Maybe Ambassador Abe has some insights, given his networks and connections. No, we ask you, if you're still on, perhaps you can enlighten us. What do you expect of the RevCon?
Ambassador Abe? Would you have any more?
Yes. Well, I think on the plenary floor, there will not be much drastic things will happen. But anyway, I think in the lobbies and outside the conference rooms, there'll be a sort of a struggle between the TPNW camp and the weapon states camp. They try to draw the countries in between to their side. Well, in a way, that is a good competition. And I think I would recommend, first of all, Japanese government to send observers to this conference. I think that is the minimum that Japan should be doing. Japan should be, I think, will be sending many NGO delegations, and they can organize sessions how to bridge the gaps between the TPNW and the NPT and how they can work together. I think that's the way people should work towards. Thank you.
John, would you like to have more comment?
Well, I understand from, I mean, this is, I'm just repeating an article from Daryl Kimball, that the NPT will be happening sometime in 22. And somewhere I recall seeing January 22 floating around, but I certainly wouldn't want to bind myself to that. I will believe it when I see it. Usually I go to these conferences because of the thing that afflicts everybody else. I probably won't be going to this one. So I'd be as cautious and cagey as everybody else. I think Ambassador Abe's comments are probably quite a good guide.
We have one more question from Dr. Tanya White. Tanya, would you make dialect to speak if you are in there, right? Rather than just reading your sentence. Tanya, would you please show up?
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah,
Yes.
great.
Great. So yes, my question was really to Ramesh. I was just really interested in the TPNW being the sort of a more convincing normative framework really for nuclear abolition, of nuclear disarmament. But I'm just wondering, we know there's a massive gap between what we already have in terms of the treaty membership and actually trying to get that treaty to become universal is an uphill struggle. And I'm just wondering what your views are on the idea that we really need to include other types of sophisticated weapons technologies now as well in discussions around developing normative frameworks, including how they link to nuclear weapons. Is that what we need to do now? Is that the approach we need to take? Or can we continue to address nuclear weapons as a separate category? So interested in your thoughts on that, Ramesh.
I'll answer that from the point of view of looking back at the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The reason we were able to get that deal in the first place was that the Americans finally accepted the European proposal to delink the nuclear issue from issues of missiles and support for terrorism and extremism and regional misbehavior. Had they insisted on the linkage, we would never have had any deal to begin with. So I think the lesson from that is that if you start to look at everything in one comprehensive framework, it becomes an alibi for frustrating any progress, even on specific issues where progress may in fact be achievable. That doesn't mean that you cannot hold negotiations and discussions in parallel on other issues. And if you make progress on a number of them simultaneously or even sequentially, then bring them together in an umbrella framework subsequently. But I don't think achievable progress on any one front should be held hostage to other contentious and difficult issues.
Right, so.
I agree. I agree entirely with that. I was just wondering if Tong would like to answer that question as well.
Tong?
I think Ramesh has said very well. I'm not sure I have much to add. I think there are, in terms of new technologies, there are, someone is at the door, but there are extreme cases where clearly we all share a joint interest in removing those scenarios of employing new technologies. For example, we all don't want to see nuclear and conventional dual-capable hypersonic missiles that can maneuver during flight, create ambiguity about target and ambiguity about warhead. It's a disaster in terms of risk reduction and risk crisis management. So I think on those clear cases of common interest, we should make near-term efforts to examine whether we should consider prohibiting those types of technologies.
All right, thank you very much, Tong. And time is almost came to the end. I'd like to have more time for discussion, but unfortunately, we don't have time more. So I'd like to hear your final comment or 10 seconds or say goodbye from all of you. And now from the Dr. Lina Yang, your final concluding remarks.
Okay, thank you for giving me the chance to join this meeting. It's very impressive, and I learned a lot because I'm in those Eastern Asian countries. So maybe my view is very closed, but I can see the open world, and I hope the DPNW and other NWFG and other kind of the visions can come true in my life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela.
Thank you very much. I would just say the papers in the journal are really excellent food for thought. I would encourage people to read them. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, you'll be the representative to the UK and New Zealand, right? Ramesh?
Thanks. I think it's very easy to end up being cynical and defeatist in this field because there seems to be a constant battle to maintain what we have achieved and avoid slipping backwards. So let me finish on a slightly more optimistic note. I'm not sure, I hope Manpreet Sethi, Dr. Sethi is still online and listening. We did an article for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists where we pointed out that last year, China and India had their worst military clash since 1967. But what was interesting was, even at the height of the clash, unlike the situation whenever there is a rise in tensions between India and Pakistan, there's fears of crossing the nuclear threshold. In the China-India clash, even though there were heavy casualties, heaviest, as I said, since 67, neither side and nor any commentator seriously broached the idea of a nuclear threshold being crossed. And we argue that one very good reason for this, likely, was the fact that these are the only two countries that have, as part of official policy, no first use of nuclear weapons, backed by appropriate force structures and deployments. And therefore, even small measures, which many of us think of as purely symbolic measures, can actually have practical on-the-ground consequences in acting as a risk reduction measure, even in the midst of a serious military clash and crisis. So progress is possible. It is possible to demonstrate some tangible outcomes from that. And I think we just need to keep chipping away in whatever small ways we can and take advantage of every opportunity that opens up to advance this nuclear risk reduction as important steps on the way to nuclear abolition.
All right, thank you. Tong?
Thank you. I think I would say that, we often face big problems, such as how to reduce the role of nuclear weapons, how to bridge the gap between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. But I think that my main argument is we can always break down big problems into smaller steps. And if you look at the issue in this way, you can easily see there are many near-term small steps that can be easily taken, but haven't been taken. So I think that's one way that we can make some concrete, hopefully incremental progress that would lead to more radical progress in the future.
All right, excellent. Our friend is here, so just 10 second goodbye comment. Ambassador Rabe, would you like some say goodbye comment? Is there, Ambassador Rabe?
Well, I think I have spoken enough, so I don't have much to say now.
All right, John, would you some say goodbye comment? John over there? No, it's gone. All right, Tanya, thank you for the moderating yesterday's session. Would you like to concluding remarks or something?
I'd just like to thank you for moderating today's session so well, and thank you to all the speakers. I thought your presentations were excellent, your papers were fabulous, and I hope everybody will read them and contribute to the debate. Feel free to submit your thoughts to the APLN, and we'll consider publishing anything that's relevant and well written and on point. So thank you very much to everybody, and wishing you all a very good weekend. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much. It's an honor to moderate today's discussion, and I'd like to see you all of you guys in person in Seoul someday soon, and hope you have a great weekend. Thank you. Say goodbye. I appreciate. And Elaine and Junsang, especially, thanks for your contribution for organizing this event. Thank you very much. Say bye.
Thank
Have
you
a great
to everyone in Seoul for making this
Thank
possible.
you.
All right. Thank you. Bye. Thank you for the audience.